Good morning, everyone. I'll wait a minute for everyone to join the room and filter in. It's great to have all of you joining us today. I do have an overwhelming need to talk sometimes as we're getting started and as everyone filters in. Go ahead and test the chat as you're coming in. I'd love to hear from you. Don't be afraid to ask questions. Use the chat box. We'll just give it another moment as the numbers keep clicking up. Even if you just wanted to say good morning in the chat box, that would be nice to hear from you. Maybe I don't see them all, so that's all right. Well, good morning, everyone. My name's Jason Hageland. What we're going to do today is just spend the next 30 minutes just kind of talking about the experience we're all sharing and kind of how we're kickstarting ourselves back into things. How are we settling in? How are we kind of coming back just a little bit? So, I've been having lots of conversations with lots of folks across the state, and people keep asking me, now what? Is this just a continual readjustment? How do we carry all this baggage with us? What do we do with all of this stuff that we've experienced? How do we manage all this emotion? And so it's been a really rich conversation as we think about stress and overload and where we're at. I go to presentations all of the time, and I think about this stuff all the time. And one of the things that we have to think about is stress is everywhere. And what does even the word stress mean? How many of you know, when you think of the word stress, what is it we're really talking about? What are the words we think of? Because stress is kind of one of those terms, it's kind of a medicalized term. I feel stress. People throw the word stress around all the time. What is stress? What is stress? Stress is really, it's an emotion. It's all those feelings. It's the exhaustion, the overload, the sadness, the grief, hopelessness, but there's also positive stressors as well. So sometimes it's good just to step back and think about what is that emotion that we keep throwing around as stress. And we think about all of the different experiences that we've gone through. We think about social and racial injustices, financial worries, political instability around the world, our personal worries with our families, all kinds of tough conversations we're having, not just with our kids, but with friends and neighbors. We talk about vaccine hesitancy. We think about all of these merged roles and the constant multitasking we all have. And then we think about all of these compounding stressors, and then we overlay that with this disaster of the pandemic, and really we start to think about how that all contributes to this collective trauma, this shared experience, and the reentry anxiety that we're still experiencing, that we never dreamed we'd still be experiencing at this point. And so we take all of that into account, and it does feel overwhelming to many. And I always go back and I find statistics like this, that how many of your employees feel emotionally drained at their workplace, and it's almost all of them. So we have all of these things going on, all of these shared experiences that are impacting everyone differently, because everyone's feeling it differently. But then we're feeling drained at work as well. And so I think about that a lot, and it makes me wonder, how are each one of you doing? And when I ask you how you're doing, do you ask your coworkers how they're doing? Do you ask your family how they're doing? And I challenge you, do sometimes you ask how you're doing and you don't really want to know the answer? We've all had that experience now and then where you just see someone in passing, you're like, hey, how are you doing? And then they really tell you, and you're like, I didn't have a half hour to stand here in the grocery store and hear that. How many of you are prepared when you ask the question, how are you doing, to sit with someone and truly hear how they're doing? When someone asks you how you're doing, how open are you? with sharing truly how you're doing, how you're managing, how your family's managing, how you're working your way through this experience that we're all having. Um, Sometimes it's hard to do, and sometimes we need to practice, and sometimes we need to make sure we're creating systems and structures in our workplaces, in our communities, that make sure we can have a safe place to find out, to check in, to connect with others on how they're doing. You know, we're experiencing this disaster, and so I do a lot of work with the Department of Human Services. I've done a lot of work with FEMA. Still do that type of work as part of disaster response and crisis response. And never in my life did I imagine that I'd be doing disaster response for 15 months at a time, because there's never been a disaster where we're still doing emotional response, assisting with the crisis this long. You know, the information from FEMA that we normally use when we talk about reactions to a disaster, the phases of a disaster, they really don't work with this particular pandemic. And so when we look at this, you know, I often challenge folks, and I've gotten handouts of them now, so I'd give you one if you were here. But I'd like to just challenge you as to where are you at? Where are your coworkers at? Where are your family members at when we think about where they are in this experience that we've had with the emotional lows, the emotional highs? This has been a very different experience. You know, I've gone to disasters where you can see the flooding, where you can see someone's house taken away and float down the Missouri River. The grieving process that comes with that, working through that, and then the reconstruction and the setbacks from that. This has been a different type of experience for many, and so we're challenged with sorting out how do we work through this experience, how do we talk about this experience, and how are we there and support our employees and others in the community. And we talk about it because of this, and this is one of my favorite graphs. I've been tracking this every 2 weeks. I go into the National Center for Health Statistics at the CDC website, and I pull this data. And what the important takeaway here is that top blue line, right? Since May 26th of 2020, over 25% of Iowans, all the way up to almost 45% of Iowans last November, were experiencing symptoms of anxiety and depression. That number has never dropped below 25%. So that's 1 in 4 of all of us have experienced anxiety and depression at some point. And this isn't the same people necessarily experiencing anxiety and depression. It means that lots of folks are experiencing anxiety and depression all of the time. And that's not ever dropped below 25% for well over a year. Pre-pandemic, the baseline was 11% of Iowans experienced anxiety and depression. So we know that doubling, tripling of those experiences of anxiety and depression is having an impact. It's having an impact on individuals' ability to function. It's having an impact in our workplaces. It's having an impact in our families. And so it's important that we acknowledge that. The other really exciting thing I started to track, because I'm like, this is kind of a bummer, is medication received and or counseling received in the previous 4 weeks. And for the first time this last April, May, we started to see an uptick in folks going to counseling and looking at medications as a support for themselves. And so more people are getting counseling that are feeling anxiety and depression for the last month. And so that's really exciting, right? So the message is getting out there that, you know what, there is support. We do need to talk about these things. So I really see this as a positive, that we're starting to acknowledge and recognize how important our emotional health is. And it's important that we're able to look at that and see those changes happening. And those statistics are exciting. And this is why it's important, right? The pandemic has impacted all of us differently, but it has disproportionately impacted some more than others. So we know women and young, the very young, were much more disproportionately impacted. 69% in this study of 18 to 29-year-old females reported negative mental health impact from the pandemic. Much fewer older adults say the same. And so we see a huge generational gap in the understanding of how important emotional wellness is, how important mental health is. And that's really creating some interesting conversations that are occurring in workplaces and around kitchen tables. all over the state. And so it's really an exciting time to be thinking about, how do we support each other? How does that look? How does it look differently? Because we know there's a need, and we know that there's an important kind of yearning to have that conversation. And sometimes we just need to normalize that during a time of chronic stress, great uncertainty, it's okay. We should be exhausted. We should feel the ups and downs. We should feel like we're depleted, and we should experience burnout, because that's normal. That's normal to experience. When we kind of recap, those last few slides, we should be feeling something. We should be feeling all of those things. And so we need to acknowledge what it means for us personally. What does burnout look like for us? What does it look like when we're depleted? And what are the steps we can take to move forward, to move forward beyond that? One little thing about me is I'm a farmer, 5th generation. So what can you learn from a farmer about managing stress? Farmers manage a lot of stress all the time. And so I've been on a few webinars, I've been to some live trainings lately. And, one of the things that we talk about a lot is the loss of routine, working from home or home working. Well, farmers always work from home. It's always there. You step out and you've got all the work that you need to do. So farmers in some ways were a bit protected throughout this pandemic. And so this spring, I spent a lot of time and energy planting. You can see all the screens there. I know where every one of my plants is located. Doing some new things right now with chemicals, nutrients. I'm really trying to make sure that plant health, from the time I planted it to the time that it came up. I've been over it 8 times with different nutrient drops, because I wanted to control everything. I wanted to control everything about that plant health. Now in July, something happened I couldn't control. I had spent all this time and nights and evenings planting. And in July, a great thing happened, right? It rained, because there hasn't been a lot of rain lately. But one of the downsides to that rain is I can't control how much. And so, I don't have irrigation systems, and I don't have a way I can cover, 400 or 500 acres of soybeans and corn. But what happened in July is, after I've invested so much of my time, my energy into growing plants that were going to, exceed, any bushels per acre, our county averages and others. Over 20 minutes, I get 1.5 inches of rain and hail. You can see those little white spots. That's hail. And so I lost 60% of my plants on 115 acres. Right? All the leaves shredded off during the time which they're flowering and blooming. Now, when I think about the past year with everything else happening, boy, it has been hard. And so we know that the people we work with, our neighbors, our colleagues, our employees, they're carrying personal things with them as well, right? People are struggling. People are lonely. People are isolated. People have been hit hard. And so we always don't know all of the ways that people have been hit hard. One of the other things that we know that losing relationships has been hard on people. And it's not just strong relationships. Sometimes it's those little relationships you lose because everything else changed around us. I miss going through the drive-through and having the Starbucks barista who would already have my name written on my cup, because I no longer have that routine, because I no longer go somewhere. All of those things changed us over the last year. And so it's really important to acknowledge how those things have changed. And they're not all bad changes, right? Many of those changes were great. I get to spend more time with my family. I'm lucky I get to be home. Many folks don't. But what have you noticed that has improved for you over the past year? What have been those hidden gems that have made you stronger, that have made your team stronger, that have made you more efficient? And how have you adapted to those new ways? Sometimes it's good for us to step back and reflect and think about I never would have tried that had it not been for the pandemic. I never would spend all day long on Zoom calls and webinars and talking to myself without a pandemic. I would have resisted this for all of my being. But now it's just normal. I feel comfortable just sitting here and talking to myself, literally, for another 14 minutes with no interaction. That can be really hard. That can be really overwhelming. But I improved that skill set over the past year. And I challenge you to think about all of the skill sets that you can't think about right now, or that you haven't thought about for a while. And what have you improved upon? What have you done that you never would have done before? What opportunities and doors have opened that would have never opened prior to the changes you had to make? And no one says those changes weren't hard. They were extremely hard. They were extremely difficult. Sometimes they were very emotionally trying. But from that experience, we may find a silver lining. And as we think about how we manage those ups and downs, those waves, right? You know, I love the analogy with water. I also love water. I love visiting oceans. I love going to the lake. I love thinking about, you know, that this whole thing is, there've been ups and downs. I think about, you know, my farm, there's ups and downs. We're all excited to install new technology and track everything and know exactly what nutrients are being, absorbed. And we do leaf samples every week, and it's exciting. And then it kind of hits a low point when we're hailed out, right? And we're like, oh, we just did all this thing. We've invested all these dollars, and we have insurance, but it's not really going to cover much of anything because we're not sure what the actual hit was. And so it's these extreme ups and downs. The waves are just, beating us up sometimes. And so I love thinking about it as to how do you manage those ups and downs? How do you move through these challenging, difficult times? I had to make it a little more Iowa-ish, so that's actually me on my boat in Okoboji. I spend a week at Okoboji every year, no matter what. My kids love it. We love to tube and kneeboard. And so are you more like I am when I'm at Okoboji? I used to have a jet boat, and I would love just to go as fast as I could. Sometimes I would just go as fast as I could across West Lake. And if you've ever been up to Okoboji, it can get pretty rough. And if I'm going as fast as I can, sometimes I don't realize when I look around, I've probably bounced everyone in my boat out, because although I can go as fast as I want, everyone can't hang on enough to stay in the boat, right? And so some of us, we just want to get to the end. We just want to get to the goal, and whatever it takes to get there, we're going to get there. Some of us may be more like that raft, where we just kind of go with the flow. And so if we put our raft in the river in Des Moines, we're just going to ride that raft until it gets to the Mississippi, and then we're just going to follow the current down to the Gulf, and then we're just going to keep floating about, right? And so sometimes those are kind of the folks that just kind of go with the flow, right? Don't make decisions, just going to go where the current takes you. And then maybe you're more like a sailboat, that you're able to put the sails up and go unlimited as far as you want, right? Because you've got the wind to take you, and so you can just sail along. You can go into the wind, you can go with the wind. If a storm comes along, you can put your sails down and anchor, and just ride the storm out. And when the storm goes by, put your sails back up and go on your way. There's a time and a place for all of those boats. There's a time and a place that we need to use all of those different things. But I love putting that analogy into place as to what happens if you're in your speedboat and you're going as fast as you can and you're bouncing people out, or what happens when we need leadership and you're just floating on your raft going with the current, and not really able to turn around and get to your destination that may be upstream instead of downstream. There's so many ways that we can use that and talk about that, but really what we're focused on here is self-care and occupational recovery. How do you create boundaries, connections, and activity to care for yourself? What are you doing every day? And so, as you think about that anchor on the sailboat of weathering these storms, and we've been through so many storms over the course of the past year, what are you doing to create healthy activities for yourself, getting outside even though it's sweltering hot sometimes, creating, setting clear boundaries with others. We're going to talk more about boundaries here in a second. And then creating connections in new and unique ways that help us to better support both ourselves and other people. We can't talk about boundaries without a Brene Brown quote. Daring to set boundaries is about having the courage to love ourselves, even when we risk disappointing others. Sometimes it's so hard to say no, especially to our boss or our supervisor. But it's so important that we set time aside for ourselves. I set a boundary this morning. I got an email late last night to do an interview on a PBS station in the eastern part of the state around the disaster and how we're supporting each other. And I love doing TV interviews, right? But I'm doing something. I'm taking my mom to Minneapolis on Friday, and so I simply emailed back and said, sorry, I can't do that. I have other obligations, because I wasn't going to change that, because that was about time for myself and creating connections with others. So I've had to practice setting boundaries and saying, no, I'm not available at that time. So you're gonna have to find someone else to cover that for me. And so that's really important, because that's self-care. That's how we build up ourselves so that we can be there to support other people as we move through some of these difficult times. And really that's about wellness, right? As we think about the 8 dimensions of wellness in our personal life, occupational wellness is just a small part of the work that we do. We need to think about all of the dimensions to create optimal health, our financial health, our environmental health, what we do intellectually to stimulate ourselves, how we grow ourselves spiritually, how we take care of ourselves physically, and then socially, how do we connect with other people? And so, when we think about wellness and we think about occupational recovery, and we think about some of these other, the other terms that we're now using as we learn more about this work, it doesn't matter which thing or which model we follow. Those are all things that protect us from burnout, from compassion fatigue, and that emotional exhaustion that we feel when we're just going through the motions because we just can't stir any more energy to do the work that we do. And so part of this process is grieving, right? We have to move through that grieving process before we can move forward. Part of grief is anger, right? And so there's so much anger in the world today. And so we think about, the denial, the bargaining, the anger, the depression, the acceptance. We really can look at all those different grief models as to where are we at in grieving the ways things were prior to the pandemic being here, and how have we adapted and changed and learned to be flexible and found ways to move forward, maybe in better, smarter, more efficient ways than we ever would have been able to. And I know personally, I've been in all places of grieving. I like to travel a lot, and so it's been a little more difficult, but we found ways to do that, right? Because that's how my family, my wife and my 2 sons and I, that's how we connect. And so that's something that's very important to us. That's a ritual, and one of the norms in our own family system. And so that's one of the things that for a while we grieved, and then we adapted, and we found ways to move forward. I love this podcast. Mass disasters create grief, confusion, loss, distrust, and fear that transcend individual experience. Collective traumas require collective healing. And I think this is so applicable for the conversation that we have, is how do we create an opportunity for collective healing, because we've all experienced this so differently, and we're all still experiencing it very differently. And so think about what you can do at your workplace. What can you do in your community? What can you do to reduce stigma? How can you help people to have accommodations and feel like they can talk about that? Are there mental health days provided at your workplace? I was just at a conference 2 days ago, and some mid-level managers told me a story about after the derecho, some of their employees literally lost the roof off their houses, and they had no paid time off. And the other employees came together and worked extra took on the workload of the people who lost their homes, and their bosses never knew about it, and they gave them paid days off because all the employees came together and did that. And everyone I talked to who was part of that said we would do it again even if it meant we got fired, because they took care of their coworkers when they were in the midst of a crisis. Sometimes we have to have tough conversations, and we have to be open and willing to have those conversations. There's lots of tough conversations happening right now, and we have to be open to that. We have to continually practice our conflict resolution skills, set healthy boundaries, limit, not overcommitting ourselves, and we have to talk about our emotional health, the mental health of our teams, the emotional well-being of our workplace. You know, we no longer have we no longer can choose not to talk about self-care in the workplace. It's now an integrated part. And that's talking about that work-life balance doesn't really fit anymore. It's a blend, our work-life blend. Are we working from home or are we home working? They're not the same thing. Most people are home working who are doing remote work. And there's many people throughout this entire experience who have continued to go to work and have worked through it, and have not had the ability to even have time off or have mental health days. And those folks who don't have access to time off are 2 times more likely to have a mental health condition. It has an impact. It has a huge impact. So as you think about the invisible suitcase, everyone has one, right? And nobody can see what's inside anybody else's suitcase. And so we really need to think about, you know, the past year, the past 15 or 16 months. There's so much has happened. And so how are we doing with patience, support, kindness, compassion? You know, how do we acknowledge our grief? And how do we make it safe to talk about it? So oftentimes it's that elephant in the room and we don't want to talk about it. And this is really where your EAP can be support and guidance of bringing those trainings in-house, of getting people connected with a counselor, and going to those sessions, because that might be the difference between having an employee and losing an employee.
All right. Would you like me to share about the EAP benefits, Jason?
I think it's a great time to do that.
All right. Well, thank you so much for all of that information. And I like what you just said. Are you home working or are you working from home? And I had to think about it, and I was like, oh, there is a difference. Yeah, and I have never really thought about it. So for those of you listening with EFR's EAP benefits, I just want to remind you of some of the resources you can count on EFR to provide to you and anyone living in your household. First, I just want to emphasize that we do have 24-hour phone support. So no matter what time of day it is, you can call. You'll speak with a licensed mental health clinician to help you address life's challenges. So it could be something going on in your home life. It could be something going on with your extended family. It could be something that you're concerned about at work. And so we are here for you. Most people call us for things like relationship issues, communication issues. We also have great resources like financial and legal consultation. They're telephonic resources. And if you just have a question about filing taxes, you know, debt consolidation, if you need to retain an attorney for whatever reason, please consider calling us first, because oftentimes the most stressful and challenging part about those situations is not knowing where to start. And so EFR gives you a really great place to start. And you can call us at 800-327-4692. So for those of you joining today or who have joined today, please use the chat, and any questions or comments you'd like to share, either questions for Jason or comments for the greater group, I will go ahead and moderate that Q&A and continue spreading the wealth of knowledge.
We'll just wait for the questions to pour in, right?
We will. Yeah, sometimes it takes a few minutes. We did have several people say good morning, and then they were happy to be here. So that was exciting to see.
Fantastic.
You know, it's interesting because when we planned for this webinar, Jason, it was last spring, and the whole back to normal, we were kind of thinking it would be, and of course things haven't changed as much as we had hoped. So
Yeah, and part of that is there is still FEMA emotional response care counselors, crisis counselors across the state. I do a lot of work with FEMA and the Iowa Department of Human Services as well. So there are resources for staff who may not qualify under an EAP program or need other types of supports, that they can call the Iowa Warm Line at 844, or the Iowa Concern Line, 800-447-1985, or the Iowa Warm Line at 844-775-9276. But those hotlines, the Iowa Concern Hotline was developed in 1985 to support farmers during the farm crisis. And this is certainly something that's impacting rural Iowa. So know that there are other resources out there and available as well. And a lot of times we'll actually direct people back to the AP program if we find out folks have access to that. But sometimes folks are falling between the cracks, and we can help support them, during this difficult time as well.
Well, several people have said thank you. It was a great presentation, and one person made a comment. I think this is probably just something she wants to share with everyone, making what we have and are experiencing real and not alone on an island. So just that what we are going through is real, and we're not isolated on an island. And I liked how, I can't remember if you said it was, I think it was the Esther Perel podcast about how, and now I'm not going to remember exactly, but basically, people need to come together in times of crisis. What was that quote specifically? It was,
now you're asking.
But that was the other thing that I really kind of, my ears perked up a little bit, and I thought, when things fall apart, or when we're experiencing something as a group, we also have to come together and recover as a group.
Right. Collective healing was her term, and I really loved that concept of collective healing. That in typical disasters, communities come together and have a united front forward, and so that's something that's been very fragmented during this disaster. And so we need to think about moving forward. How do we create that collective healing? In our at least in our workplaces and the pods that we find ourselves, so that we can be as healthy as we can.
Most definitely. Well, thank you so much for your time and expertise, Jason. It's always great to have you on our webinar panel, and I appreciate all of the wisdom you shared today. And I feel like I can confidently speak for everyone else that they appreciate it too. So if you're listening and want to stay in touch with EFR, we have Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn social media platforms. We also have a website with a variety of resources where you can watch past webinars, register for upcoming webinars, and this webinar will be posted probably by tomorrow. So if you thought it was great and want to share it with other people, or just want to take a listen again, please go to efr.org and check it out. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.